The second key trend to be keenly aware of is the current theological civil war that will determine the future of conservative politics. There are two factions vying for influence within the Christian voting bloc. There are the Christian nationalists, who occupy the more conservative, fire and brimstone end of the spectrum, and then there are the moderate Christians, who are just that, far more moderate. The key thing to know is that the Christian nationalists are actively making gains within the Christian voting bloc. I've talked to Presbyterian church elders who say they have internal meetings to deal with this rise of explicitly political Christianity coming from within the church. And you see it in popular media in the form of Christian identitarianism and victimhood politics.
I'm a Christian first, okay? And so my concerns are going to be with what's happening to Christians all around the world, because it is us. We are the #1 most persecuted religion in the world. And all Christians watching this need to realize the time is now to start speaking up.
A consistent but almost never noted theme of American foreign policy is that it is always the Christians who suffer. When there's a war abroad that the United States is funding, it is Christians who tend to die disproportionately. And this goes back a long way, 60 years really, to Vietnam, where Catholics in that country were massacred. But it's accelerated.
But what you need to understand is the underlying philosophy at play here. The behavior and rules that Christians abide by are determined by the process of interpreting the Bible, a process called exegesis. There's many Bible verses, but some Bible verses become the battlegrounds over theological matters. The entire debate around homosexuality, for example, centers around basically 5 to 6 Bible verses. The debate about whether Christians should listen to the Pope or not centers around 3 or 4. And the fundamental divide between the Christian nationalists and the moderate Christians centers around mostly one particular story in the Bible. It's a story of Jesus Christ assaulting the leadership of the temple in Jerusalem.
Right. Well, Jesus is in the temple and he's fighting with the chief priests, and he's telling them, you know, he's fighting with them at Passover. So thousands of people surrounding them. He's embarrassing them in the temple. And
his boldness is really shocking.
Yes.
To people who haven't read it before.
Yes.
The rage that he displays at the leadership,
yes,
the religious leadership, is just like it's
nothing else.
It comes right off the page.
And which is so ironic, because you see evangelicals who are like, you need to be more Christ-like, right? You need to be, which means like wimpy and weak and inoffensive.
Sweeping into the temple and knocking over tables and driving people out with a whip.
When it comes to American conservatism, you have to remember that politics is downstream from culture, and culture is downstream from theology, which is why it's so important to wrestle with and understand the fundamental theological dispute at play. When it comes to figuring out the meaning of any text, but particularly a text like the Bible, there's an infinite number of ways you could interpret it, but only a subset of those interpretations are actually viable when you play them out in real life.
So we'll start with what I think is the most powerful central claim of postmodernism, a claim which I think is actually correct, and which also has bedeviled many other fields, including, surprisingly enough, artificial intelligence. The claim is something like, there is an infinite number of ways to interpret any even finite set of phenomena.
And so this is one of the complex problems that actually led to the rise of postmodern interpretations of literature, which is that if you take a complex narrative, there's a very large number of ways of interpreting it, and it isn't self-evident which of those are canonically correct.
Although there is a very large number of potential interpretations of the world, that does not mean that there is an equally large number of viable interpretations of the world.
The insolvable problem is knowing which interpretation from the set of potentially viable interpretations is appropriate to apply in the current environment that you're in. You can imagine a culture where Christianity is the dominant oppressive force, in which, a more moderate theological interpretation would be beneficial. But in a culture where degeneracy runs rampant and all traditional moral rules are abandoned, it makes sense to emphasize the more strict theological approach.